Hello, this is Chuck Stull, and this week we're going to look at the automobile industry, another large important industry, one that's been particularly important here in Michigan. And I imagine that some of you have family members who work or have worked in this industry. Now, there's been lots of drama in the U.S. auto industry within your lifetime. After the financial crisis, the big car companies were losing billions of dollars every quarter. We saw government bailouts. We saw bankruptcies in 2009. Firms that were too big to fail needed government support to survive and then return to profitability. And that had a big impact on the state of Michigan. In 2010, Michigan led the nation with nearly 15% unemployment rate. So in order to understand this, we need to look back at the structure of the auto industry. The big three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, dominated the U.S. auto industry for decades, with peak market shares of those three companies between 94 and 98%. It's a very highly concentrated oligopoly. In the 1960s, General Motors by itself had over 60% of the market share. That has been dropped to less than 20%. At one time, General Motors was the largest industrial firm in the United States and one of the largest in the world. All three companies were multinational and struggled to survive after the financial crisis. If we look at General Motors' stock price in 1999, it was selling for $87 a share. It dropped to less than $2, and then there was a government bailout. The old stock went to zero, and a new stock was formed. But in order to understand what happened, we probably should go back and start with the history of this industry to explain what happened more recently. If we look at the market structure just over 100 years ago, we had many small producers. Kalamazoo had several independent auto companies over the years. The picture shown on this slide is the Romer, which was made here in Kalamazoo in the early 1920s. But this competitive market structure was pretty short-lived and was replaced by a few large firms or an oligopoly. So what we wanted to look at again, or turn back to, was what would be the advantage of being big? Why did these small auto companies fail and the big auto companies succeed? And again, economies of scale is a good answer, a good thing to look at. So this is a picture of Henry Ford with the Model T, and Ford was an early leader in scale economy. And one of the first places we could look for economies of scale is in assembly. So the Model T is a classic example of mass production cost savings through standardization and specialization. Ford worked to improve the assembly line, introducing the moving assembly line, and learned to perfect the process. Now the Model T was produced over a number of years, but as the production process, the price of the car fell because the productivity was much higher. So if we look at a table showing the price for Model T over time, we can see in the early years the price went up from $850 to $950. And then we see a gradual decline. The real big increase in productivity came around 1912, 1913 to 1914, and you can see the price fell from $600 to less than $500, and the quantity increased from under 80,000 cars to nearly a quarter, or to over a 250,000 cars. And you can see that the price continued to drop over the next few years, and the quantity continued to increase. And Ford dominated the early decades of the 20th century. Of course, automobile production advanced and the economies of scale in assembly got bigger and bigger, and it does explain part of the market concentration. However, it doesn't explain all of it. A typical assembly plant might produce between 150,000 and 250,000 cars per year. Right? If that's all we needed to have an auto company, the United States market could support 30 to 40 car companies if each of those plants were independently owned. And if we look at the big three before their restructuring, in North America, all of them operated multiple plants. So General Motors operated 25 US plants, plus 4 in Canada and 2 in Mexico. Ford had 16 assembly plants in the US, 3 in Canada, 3 in Mexico, and Chrysler had 9 assembly plants in the United States, and then 3 in Canada, 3 in Mexico. And the North American auto industry has been integrated for quite a long time across those 3 countries. So this means we need to look beyond simple assembly line economies of scale to explain the overall size of the big 3. So let's look at the vertical chain of production. The vertical chain of production for automobiles, of course, starts with raw materials, so steel, rubber, glass. Those are um, manufactured into different parts and components: engines, transmissions, fuel injectors, seats, tires, windows, body parts, and often into entire modules. So it's very common to have all the instruments and all of the wiring put into a dashboard before it is shipped to an auto assembly plant. The assembly itself is where the autos are made, the auto plants, where all of those different parts and components are gathered together and made into a car. And then we look at the distribution. Essentially, we have 2 important um, uh, ways of selling cars. One is through dealers, and car dealers are franchisees. These are independent firms connected by long-term contracts and protected by state regulation. And so the dealers in the auto industry in some ways look like the franchises of the oil gas stations. The other important distribution for autos would be the fleet sales, which would go to things like rental car companies. So the question, of course, in this vertical chain of production is which components and which parts should the companies buy and which should they make? And here the decision varies, and it varies both by specific part and by company. So some parts are frequently vertically integrated and some parts are almost never vertically integrated. So the tires, I think, in the history of automobiles have mainly been bought. The car companies don't produce tires themselves, they purchase them from tire companies. With the drivetrain, it depends. So we could look at Ford. Ford has bought transmissions from Borg Warner when the supplier raised their price because they were perhaps exploiting some market power they had. Ford realized it would be cheaper to make its own transmissions, and they moved production to their internal production. And then Borg Warner, the independent supplier, cuts price on the transmissions in order to win business. Body parts, for the most part, have been made internally. And again, we discussed earlier design specificity. There are huge setup costs for stamping body parts. This is a picture of an auto body die. These are expensive to design, fabricate, and test, and all of those tooling costs are sunk. Right? And so if there were independent markets here, we'd have the holdup problem. And so vertical integration happened very early in the 20th century for those parts. For other parts, it depends on the specific part and on the company. General Motors was the most vertically integrated of the big 3, and peaking at around 70% vertical integration. The recent trend has been to move away from vertical integration The auto companies are spinning off parts divisions or have spun off part divisions into separate companies. They've been looking to outsource more components, to buy more often than to make. And again, often those will be covered with by long-term contracts. If we do look at the components, some of the components have bigger economies of scale than auto assembly, and that may again explain why we have a bigger but a smaller number of firms. So if we look at things like engines, transmissions, and fuel injectors, these all have large economies of scale in production. The minimum efficient scale is often been estimated at about 1 million per year, which again would be much bigger than the assembly plants. So if engines, transmissions, and fuel injectors are vertically integrated, the U.S. could support 10 efficient-sized firms. So we're getting closer to the three that we've actually seen, and if we move to the modern era, we're perhaps looking at close to that number if we include some of the transplants that we'll talk about a little bit later. Let me move to a couple other sources of economies of scale. The big three typically spend billions of dollars each year on advertising. With television campaigns, you could have a $1 billion ad campaign and spread it across more cars. And again, that would give you lower unit costs, giving an advantage to larger firms. So we have scale economies in national advertising. Hard to compete if you're an unknown small brand. Another area where there's economies of scale would be the dealer and service network. If you were a new entrant, you really trying to compete as a mainstream car in the United States, you would need to have enough dealers to cover the entire country. The U.S. has a mobile population, and people often drive for tourism, and they want to be able to have their car repaired or serviced wherever they might end up in the country. And so it's hard to come in a very small number. You need to have several thousand dealers in order to reach most of the population. Now there are roughly 18,000 dealers. Most of these are franchised, right? So not owned but not fully independent, and they are protected by state law. Some states have very strong franchise rules in terms of the auto industry. So Tesla, who we will mention briefly in the future of the auto industry, has a different model. It wants to sell all of its cars direct to consumers. And in some states, they've successfully been doing that. Other states, like Michigan, were very reluctant to allow that to happen. So there are many sources of economies of scale that do help us understand why the auto industry is not a competitive industry, why we see and have seen a tight oligopoly. There is a point, though, where cost advantages run out. And a real question in the auto industry has been how big is too big? Even before the problems of the financial crisis, some economists and analysts thought General Motors was too big, that they were experiencing diseconomies of scale. Essentially, they had become too big to manage. It was hard to have good control over all of the production decisions and actions, and that was reflected in lower productivity from GM compared to some of the international producers. And GM, even before the financial crisis and the auto crisis, it was finding it was unable to maintain that large market share that it had at one point. After the financial crisis, General Motors seemed to accept that they had been too big, and they did restructure into a smaller, more agile company. We will return to several of these issues. Thank you for listening. This is Chuck Stull, Kalamazoo College.